Hey there, welcome back to Plow and Pantry. Today I am taking you through a day of harvesting potatoes and doing a lot of food preservation. This is actually footage from mid-October, and here we are now mid-November. I've been having computer issues and some workers at the house pounding on things, and that makes it hard to get videos filmed or narrated or edited and up. But here we are. This was after our first frost, so you will later see some damage to basil and sweet potato vines, but that's okay. I really could have still filmed this yesterday even because that frost was the last one we had until last night. So there was a whole month in between frosts there for us. I started in the morning with garden chores all over the property. I was out for about 2.5 total hours, but it was random stuff that I didn't film until I got over here to harvest potatoes. Today I'm harvesting the Huckleberry Gold and Burbank Russets. I also harvested Sarpo Mira potatoes about a month before this. Those were new to me and they were just ready to harvest faster. They're a faster growing variety. They were good. I'm also using this time to kind of weed the same area and winter prep the general area where the potatoes are. Once the potatoes start to grow, if I don't get weeds when they're tiny babies, I have to kind of let them grow because otherwise pulling them out would mess with the potatoes since those grow underground. And you don't want to mess with their environment. You don't want it disrupted. So I also harvested my remaining pimento peppers over there in that area too. I got those canned at a later date, so they're not in this video. They were just the same area, so it made sense to take care of those as well because this area had onions earlier, potatoes down the middle, and peppers there on the left. So I'm kind of just pulling things out and weeding as I go. Most of this area I harvested by hand. And then I go back later with the pitchfork and try to gently loosen the dirt and make sure I got them all. I like to not use my pitchfork or any shovels until I need to because I don't want to risk spearing my potatoes, which I always do one or two. The soil has now been built up in this section of the garden about 3 years, so it's way easier to dig through by hand than, say, like a new bed would be. My original plan was to go inside after the potatoes. They were my last task of the day, but I decided at the last minute to also go ahead and harvest my sweet potatoes. I only had a 4x4 bed of them this year, so I knew it wouldn't take me long and they were ready, so I just went for it. I hadn't planned on doing sweet potatoes this year at all, like growing them, but I was at a small local nursery one day and they had starts and I was like, why not, and just decided to throw some in the ground. They did well. I've never had sweet potatoes not do well, so it wasn't surprising. These were Beauregard, which I have never planted before. They're a pretty common variety. I just usually ordered starts from different types. I plant those usually. So the sweet potatoes took a lot of digging and loosening the soil, even though they were in a raised bed, because they just really entrenched themselves in the bottom. I broke off a few along the way. I ended up having to pull back the blanket of vines. It kind of form this blanket over the top and then dig straight in the dirt. Usually I do sections when I'm harvesting and I move along the vines. Made it hard to really see what was going on in here. So I just yanked them, pulled the potatoes that were attached to them, and then I went digging through the bed for the bulk of the sweet potatoes. After the sweet potatoes were all done, I went in and showered and had lunch and got ready for the second half of the day, which I was planning on spending the afternoon doing just a couple of food preservation projects, but it ended up being kind of a snowball food preservation day. Sometimes things just get in my mind. I'll see things I need to do and I just can't get rid of them, so I just got to get them done. So I started with getting some grass-fed beef bones out of my freezer and into my Instant Pot to make beef bone broth so I could can it later. And if you followed along for my October freezer challenge, which I can link for you, you know that a friend gave me for free 10 pounds of really good quality beef bones for stock, and I just couldn't pass that up. So I've been slowly working through those. I got those going in the Instant Pot with water and a little bit of apple cider vinegar. That's all I put in my broth when I can it, so I can flavor it however I want to when I cook, and I don't have to worry about whether or not the other ingredients with it are going to be too salty or anything like that. And after I got that going, I decided to can up a roast I had bought the day before on sale at the grocery store. I just cut it up and raw pack can it. That is my preferred way to can beef and chicken, is raw packing them. I have videos on both how I can beef bone broth and how I raw pack chicken, so I can link those in the description box below if you're interested in those. You saw me there cutting off the main piece of fat from the beef before I canned it. That's a preference. When I slow cook a beef roast, I leave that on. It kind of melts down into the roast and flavors it, and if there's anything gross at the end, it separates pretty easily with a fork. But when I can it, I remove that because it doesn't do the same thing in the canner, and I don't like the texture of the fat after it's been canned. Also, a lot of fat in a canned item can mess up a seal and has a potential of shortening shelf life too. So I just remove most of the fat, chunk it up, pack it tight, wipe the rims, and then get it into my digital pressure canner there. While that got going in the canner, I dealt with some apples that we got at our local favorite apple house. We got several types, but I decided to get a few Macintosh while we were there because that is my favorite for applesauce. I didn't get a ton of them though, so I just made a 1-quart batch. I put it straight into the fridge and didn't bother canning it. We just ate it fresh. Since I was doing a smaller batch, I did not get out the peeler, core, slicer thing. I just cut them up. I think cutting each apple into 8s is what I did here. Sliced off the inner portions that has the seeds, and then I peeled the slices. All the waste went to my chickens because they also love apples, and I actually find peeling them this way is a lot easier to me than peeling a whole apple and then slicing it. It's just a personal preference. I got those put into some large chunks and rinsed again, and then into a pot. And all I add is just a little bit of water to make sure they don't burn before they have a chance to soften and release their own juices, and a splash of lemon juice to keep it from turning brown, and a small dash of salt. That's all I put in my applesauce. We don't really feel the need for added sugar here, and one of my kids doesn't like cinnamon, so I don't add that either because that can be added by anybody later. While the apples were cooking down, I decided to head back out to the garden and trim some herbs to preserve. This was not part of my original plan today, but it popped in my head and it just would not let go. I first went over to my annual herb section for this year, and you can see that the basil has some frost damage and it got wilty. I was able to salvage some underlayer leaves that were protected by the upper layers. I have plenty of basil from this year, so I wasn't really worried about that loss. I mainly wanted to get the next load of parsley in. Parsley usually stands up well to a few frosts. I got a lot of parsley trimmed actually, a little bit of dill and a few leaves of basil. And then I decided to go over to my new perennial herb bed, which is half overtaken with large weeds. I got some oregano, which is next to those large weeds, and it's a new plant this year. I did have an old oregano plant that was in a different part of the same bed that I had been harvesting from, but that was like 3 or 4 year old plant. That was accidentally weed-eated by my husband, so I had to plant a new one. That was when I decided to turn this whole bed that's falling apart into kind of a perennial herb bed and try just like a raised bed without borders, raised row type thing. So I also had some sage back there in the middle of those really tall weeds, and I got a little bit of rosemary out of there as well. I took those herbs back inside and started getting them washed up and onto dehydrator trays. I split the parsley up here. I put some of it on the dehydrator trays with other herbs and kept some of them out for the freeze dryer. I use both types. I use the dehydrated for dried parsley like you normally would that you buy in the store, but I also use freeze-dried parsley in place of fresh parsley a lot in the winter. So I like to have both on hand. I don't rehydrate the freeze-dried parsley or anything. I just toss it in as it is, and it works pretty darn well in most instances. I might put 1 or 2 parsley plants in my perennial bed next year because sometimes parsley will go 2 or 3 years here when it's mulched well. The roots stay alive and it grows back up from the ground in the spring and comes back on its own. Sometimes, but not always, but it can go a couple years. So if I'm planting it anyways, I might as well stick some in there and see what I can do with it. After I got all the parsley that I was going to dehydrate and the basil and the dill and the oregano and the sage and the rosemary on the dehydrator trays, I had a couple of trays left, so I decided to go back outside and harvest some rose petals to add to the dehydrator since that has also been on my list. I put some of these in my chicken treat jar, and some of those go into my own jar for teas and body products. So I got those washed up and put on the trays, and then by then the apples were cooked through. So I used an immersion blender to get those sauced up, and this batch made a quart jar. When I filled it, there was about half a cup too much, so I spooned it into a bowl and I just had a snack while I kept working. And I got that quart jar into the fridge. Then I started working on the freeze dryer trays. My canner with the beef was done at this point, so I was just letting it come down from pressure while I was doing other things. So I got the parsley onto the freeze dryer trays, and then I filled the rest of I loaded them up with more apples. These were from the same trip to the Apple House, but these are Honeycrisp. My middle daughter's favorite snack is freeze-dried Honeycrisp apples. So I'm constantly making these. I sliced these much the same I do for applesauce, only then I slice each 8 into thirds so that it's like a thin chip. I don't bother peeling these. The peels aren't really noticeable. Whenever I do apples, I get the whole apples into a large bowl with lemon juice and water, after they're washed, of course. It helps keep pulling off anything like wax and kills bacteria. And then also as I slice the apples, I slip them right back into that bowl with the lemon juice, and that keeps them from browning. And then I lay them on a single layer on the freeze dryer trays, and I get those going in the freeze dryer. By then it was time to pull out the beef that I had canned and start the beef bone broth. So I pulled the broth out of my Instant Pot and strained it. Then I got it into the jars, 1-inch headspace. I'm using my 1.5 pint jars here that I got from Azure Standard. I love these jars. I love their size, their shape. I just think they're cool. These ones are the wide mouth ones, the straight jars. They also come in a regular 1.5 pint jar. I will link Azure Standard below if you're interested in getting your hands on these. I put the beef broth in them, rims wiped with vinegar, superb canning lids, which are also one of my favorite things I get from Azure. You can also get them on Amazon. They are less expensive on Azure, but not everyone wants to do Azure, so I can link those below in an Amazon link for you too if you'd like. I also use these when I am canning meat or bone broth. Like, I don't use any other type of lid because these are my most expensive things to can, and I love the seals from these lids, and I am way more confident about my meat and broth staying sealed while they're in storage in the pantry. FYI, I did wait a bit between removing the beef and adding the broth into the canner. The digital canner works best if it has a little time to come down a bit in temperature before you start a new load. So it was a little bit later, pajamas kind of later, a lot later, when I actually pulled them out of the canner. That is the sum of what I got harvested and preserved on this day. My body hurt afterwards, but it was that good kind of hurt with feelings of having had a productive day when you fall asleep kind of thing. Thank you guys so much for joining me here today. I appreciate that you chose to spend some of your valuable time with me. If you like this kind of content, feel free to like and subscribe. I do all things related to gardening, homesteading, food preservation, and cooking here. Everything from putting the plow to the ground for planting to getting that product in the pantry and all things in between.